Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stared at the dying control panel of his cargo ship. 3 months had passed since the pirate attack near the Outer Rim, and his ship was barely holding together. The navigation systems flickered, like dying fireflies, and the life support made strange grinding noises every few hours. His only companion, Kate Phillips, crawled out from under the engine housing with grease on her face and bad news in her eyes. The engines are running on fumes. "Jake and we lost another cooling unit this morning," Kate said while tossing her wrench into the toolbox. "We need to find a port soon, or we will be floating dead in space within the week." Jake nodded and checked their star charts for the 100th time. The nearest friendly port was 2 weeks away, but there was something closer that made his stomach turn. Astros Prime. The home world of the Zephyrian Empire was only 3 days away. The Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy as proud warriors who looked down on humans as nothing more than weak traders. "We don't have a choice," Jake said quietly. "It's the Zephyrian world, or we die out here." Kate made a face, like she had bitten something sour, but she knew he was right. They plotted a course for Astros Prime and hoped the warrior aliens would at least let them dock long enough to buy supplies. 2 days later, their damaged ship limped into Zephyrian space. Jake expected to be met by patrol ships demanding they leave immediately, but instead, they found something incredible. Hundreds of ships from dozens of different species filled the space around Astros Prime. Massive vessels that looked like floating. Cities sat next to sleek fighters that gleamed like silver bullets. "What in the galaxy is going on here?" Kate whispered as she stared at the view screen. Jake was about to answer when their communication system crackled to life. A deep voice, speaking heavily accented Standard, filled their small bridge attention incoming vessel. "You are cleared to land at Tournament Port Dock 17. Please proceed immediately to registration upon arrival. The grand tournament begins." In 2 days, Jake and Kate looked at each other with confusion. Tournament. What tournament? Before they could ask questions, their ship was caught in a tractor beam and pulled toward the planet's surface. The massive world of Astros Prime stretched out below them, covered in red rock formations and gleaming. Cities that looked like they were carved from single pieces of stone. They landed at the designated dock, and Jake stepped outside to find chaos everywhere. Aliens of every shape and size moved through the port area. He saw the 4 armed Corvin with their natural armor plating loading weapons onto hover platforms. The swift Veltari moved like liquid lightning between the slower species. Massive, 12-foot-tall Brutari with skin like livingstone carried equipment that would have required machines for most species to lift. The strangest sight was the Nethians, who seemed to float just slightly above the ground, while their eyes glowed with psychic energy. Jake had heard stories about all these species, but had never seen so many different aliens in one place. "Excuse me, human," a voice said behind him. Jake turned to see an elderly Zephyrian wearing official robes approaching. The alien was tall and lean with the typical warrior build of his species, and his scaled skin was a deep green color. "Yes, sir," Jake replied, trying to sound respectful. "You are late for registration," the Zephyrian said while checking a data pad. "Captain Jake Morrison representing the Earth Coalition." "Correct," Jake blinked in surprise. "Earth Coalition." He was just a cargo hauler with a broken ship, but before he could correct the mistake, the official grabbed his arm and started pulling him toward a large building to... "I think there has been some confusion," Jake protested, but the Zephyrian was not listening. The registration hall was enormous, with a ceiling that seemed to reach up forever. Banners from dozens of worlds hung from the walls, and the sound of many different languages filled the air. The official pushed Jake into a line with other beings who were clearly warriors. The alien next to him was a Corvin who stood nearly 8 feet tall and had weapons strapped to all 4 arms. The warrior looked down at Jake and made a sound that might have been laughter. "Are you lost, little human?" the Corvin asked. The nursery section is in another building. Several other contestants nearby turned to look at Jake, and he felt his face turn red. He was about to leave when he heard a new voice that made everyone in the hall fall silent. The voice belonged to Princess Luna of the Zephyrian Empire. She walked into the registration hall surrounded by guards, but Jake barely noticed them. The princess was tall, even for a Zephyrian, with scales that shifted from deep blue to silver, depending on how the light hit them. Her eyes were the color of liquid gold, and when she looked directly at Jake, he felt like she could see right through. Welcome, warriors, to the grand tournament, she said in a voice that carried easily through the massive hall. You have come from across the galaxy to compete for my hand in marriage and the alliance of our two peoples. The tournament will test not just your strength, but your wisdom, honor, and heart. Jake wanted to run, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. This was insane. He was not a warrior, and he certainly was not here to marry an alien princess, no matter how beautiful she might be. The tournament will consist of 6 trials, Princess Luna continued. Strength, speed, cunning, courage, honor, and heart. The winner will not only gain my hand, but will help unite our species in a new age of cooperation. She paused, and her golden eyes swept across the assembled warriors. When her gaze landed on Jake again, he saw something that surprised him. Curiosity. Not mockery or dismissal, but genuine interest in the small human who clearly did not belong. The trials begin tomorrow at dawn, she announced. May the best warrior win. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake finally found his voice and tried to approach the registration desk to explain the mistake. But a massive Brutari warrior stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Move aside, little human, the stone-skinned giant rumbled. You are in the way of real warriors. That comment made something snap inside Jake. He had spent 3 months keeping his ship together through sheer determination. He had survived pirate attacks, cosmic storms, and equipment failures that would have killed most people. He might not be a traditional warrior, but he was not weak. I am registered just like you, Jake said, looking up at the Brutari without backing down. We will see tomorrow who the real warrior is. The Brutari laughed, a sound like boulders grinding together. Several other contestants turned to watch what they assumed would be a very short confrontation, but Jake stood his ground and stared right back at the massive alien. Very well, little human, the Brutari said finally. I am Commander Stone. Try not to die too quickly in the first trial. It would be boring. Jake watched the giant alien walk away, then turned to find Princess Luna standing nearby. She had been watching the entire exchange, and now she approached him with that same curious expression. You are either very brave or very foolish human, she said quietly, so others could not hear. Jake met her golden eyes and felt that strange connection again. Maybe both, Your Highness. She smiled, then a real smile that transformed her entire face. What is your name? Warrior Jake Morrison, Jake replied. And I should probably mention that I am not actually here to compete in your tournament. There has been some kind of mistake. Princess Luna tilted her head and studied him carefully. Perhaps, she said. Or perhaps fate has brought you here for a reason. The tournament is open to all species as I requested. If you are registered, then you have the right to compete. But I am just a cargo hauler, Jake protested. I am not a warrior. The Princess looked around the hall at the assembled fighters, then back at Jake. Being a warrior is not about size or strength, she said softly. It is about heart. Tomorrow we will see what kind of heart you have, Jake Morrison. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing alone in the middle of the registration hall. Around him, the greatest warriors in the galaxy prepared for trials that would test everything they thought they knew about combat honor and courage. Jake looked back toward the docks where Kate was probably still working on their ship. He could walk away right now, and no one would blame him. But something in Princess Luna's words had stirred something inside him. Something that reminded him why humans had spread across the galaxy. Despite being smaller and weaker than most other species, they never gave up. Jake Morrison, cargo hauler and accidental tournament contestant, walked out of the registration hall with his head held high. Tomorrow he would face the first trial and show these alien warriors what humans were really made of. He might not win, but he would make sure they remembered him. Behind him, Princess Luna watched from a balcony as the small human walked away with determination in every step. For the first time since the tournament was announced, she found herself genuinely curious about what would happen next. This Jake Morrison was different from the other warriors, and different might be exactly what the galaxy needed. Dawn came too quickly for Jake Morrison. He had spent most of the night lying awake in the small quarters they had been assigned, thinking about what he had gotten himself into. Kate had laughed until she cried when he told her about the registration mix-up, and then she had gotten serious. You are really going to do this, aren't you? She said while shaking her head. You are going to compete against alien super warriors in some crazy tournament. Jake had nodded, because what else could he do? He was already registered, and walking away now would bring shame not just on himself, but on all of humanity. Every species. in the galaxy would hear about the human who was too scared to even try. The first trial was held in an enormous arena that could seat 100,000 spectators. Jake looked up at the crowd and felt his stomach flip. Beings from dozens of worlds had come to watch the tournament, and most of them were pointing at him and making what he assumed were jokes about the small human. The trial itself was simple in concept, but terrifying in practice. Each contestant had to lift massive stone blocks and throw them as far as possible. The blocks were arranged by size, with the largest being nearly the size of a small building. Jake watched as the other warriors examined the stones and chose which ones to attempt. Commander Stone, the massive Brutari warrior, approached the largest block available. The crowd fell silent as the 12-foot giant wrapped his stone arms around the boulder. With a roar that shook the arena, he lifted the block above his head and took several running steps before hurling it through the air. The stone flew nearly 1,000 meters before crashing to the ground, and the crowd erupted in cheers. "That will be difficult to beat," announced the tournament judge, an elderly Zephyrian with ceremonial tattoos covering his scaled arms. Next came war leader Thex IV, armed Corvin champion. He selected the second largest block and used all 4 arms to grip it properly. His technique was different from the Brutari, more controlled and precise. When he released the stone, it flew in a perfect arc, landing 800 meters from the throwing line. Still an incredible distance that had the crowd on their feet. One by one, the other contestants took their turns. Swift runner Zara, the Veltari champion, surprised everyone by selecting a medium-sized block and using her incredible speed to build momentum. Her throw reached 700 meters through sheer velocity rather than raw strength. Mind Bender, Kalo the Nethian, used psychic powers to enhance his throw, reaching 650 meters. When Jake's turn came, the arena fell completely silent. He walked slowly toward the blocks, studying each one carefully. The other contestants had focused on the largest stones they could lift, but Jake was thinking differently. He selected one of the smaller blocks, barely 300 pounds, which brought laughter from several species in the crowd. "Look, the human cannot even lift a real stone," someone called out in standard. Jake ignored the taunts and knelt beside his chosen block. While the others had relied on pure strength, Jake had spent his years in space learning about physics and engineering. He studied the stone's shape, looking for the best grip points. He examined its density and estimated its aerodynamic properties more. Importantly, he was watching the wind patterns in the arena. The massive structure created air currents that could help or hinder a throw depending on timing and angle. Jake had noticed that all the previous throwers had ignored these factors, focusing only on raw power. Jake took his position and began to spin like an ancient Earth discus thrower. The crowd watched in confusion as the human built up rotational momentum, using his entire body as a lever. At the perfect moment, when the wind conditions aligned, Jake released the stone at precisely the right angle. The block flew through the air, following a trajectory that none of the other warriors had achieved. It was not the raw power throw of the Brutari or the speed-enhanced throw of the Veltari, but something entirely different. The stone sailed on the arena's air currents, gaining distance through aerodynamics rather than muscle when it finally landed. The distance markers showed 950 meters, only 50 meters behind Commander Stone's throw, and achieved with a fraction of the raw strength. The arena exploded in confusion and amazement. Princess Luna, who had been watching from the royal box, leaned forward with obvious interest. Even Emperor Voss, her father, was staring at the small human with something that might have been respect impossible. Commander Stone roared. The human cheated somehow. The judges quickly reviewed the rules but found no violations. Jake had simply approached the trial with a completely different strategy than anyone else had considered. Technique and intelligence had nearly overcome raw physical power. That was unexpected. Princess Luna said quietly to her father as they watched Jake bow to the crowd. Indeed, the Emperor replied. Perhaps this tournament will be more interesting than we anticipated. The second trial took place immediately after the first, with no time for the contestants to rest. This trial tested speed through a complex obstacle course filled with barriers, walls, and moving platforms. The course stretched for 2 kilometers and required not just speed, but agility and quick thinking. Swift runner Zara approached the starting line with confidence. Speed was her species' greatest advantage, and this trial played to all their strengths. When the signal sounded, she flowed like liquid lightning over, under, and around every obstacle. Her natural agility allowed her to take risks that would have been impossible for other species. She completed the course in 4 minutes and 37 seconds, setting a time that seemed impossible to beat. The other warriors followed with varying degrees of success. Commander Stone's massive size worked against him as he had to smash through barriers that other contestants could slip around. War Leader Thex used his 4 arms to climb and swing, but his heavy armor slowed him down. Mindbender. Kalo tried to use psychic powers to move obstacles, but the rules forbade altering the course. When Jake's turn came, he did not immediately sprint toward the first obstacle. Instead, he stood at the starting line for nearly 30 seconds, studying the entire course layout. The crowd began to whisper impatiently. But Jake was memorizing every detail he could see during the strength trial. Jake had been watching this course out of the corner of his eye. He had noticed that the obstacles created shadows and gaps that could be used as shortcuts. More importantly, he had observed how the moving platforms operated and had calculated their timing. When Jake finally started running, he took a completely different path than the other contestants. Where they had gone over barriers, he slid underneath them, using his smaller size as an advantage. Where they had climbed walls, he found gaps between sections that only a human-sized being could squeeze through. The crowd watched in fascination, as Jake treated the obstacle course like a 3-dimensional puzzle to be solved rather than a simple test of speed. He used momentum and physics to his advantage, sliding down ramps and using his forward motion to carry him across gaps that others had to jump. Most surprisingly, Jake had noticed that some of the obstacles were designed to move in sequence. By timing his approach correctly, he could ride moving platforms like elevators, gaining height and distance without expending energy on climbing. When Jake reached the final section, he was actually ahead of swift runner Zara's pace. The crowd was on their feet watching the impossible sight of a human, not just competing with, but potentially beating the galaxy's fastest species. Jake crossed the finish line in 4 minutes and 12 seconds, beating Zara's record by 25 seconds. The arena fell completely silent for several heartbeats before exploding in the loudest cheers of the day. Swift runner Zara approached Jake at the finish line, her usual confidence replaced by genuine curiosity. "How did you move so fast, human? Your species is not known for speed." Jake was breathing hard but managed to smile. "We are not the fastest," he replied, "but we are good at finding better ways to do things." Princess Luna was now standing in her box, staring down at the human warrior with undisguised fascination. Twice now he had defied expectations, not through superior physical abilities, but through completely different thinking. That evening, Jake returned to his ship to find Kate working frantically on their engine repairs. She looked up when he entered, covered in grease and grinning widely. "So how did the mighty human warrior do in his first day of alien competition?" she asked with a smirk. Jake told her about the trials, and Kate's expression slowly changed from amusement to amazement. "You actually beat them," she said. "You beat aliens who are literally built for strength and speed, not through being stronger or faster," Jake replied. "Through thinking differently." Kate nodded slowly. "That sounds like humanity, all right. Too stubborn to know when we are beaten and too curious to do things the normal way." As Jake prepared for sleep that night, he found an unexpected visitor waiting outside his quarters. Princess Luna stood alone in the corridor, wearing simple robes instead of her royal garments. Jake bowed awkwardly, unsure of the proper protocol. "Your Highness," he said, "is everything all right? I wanted to speak with you about your performance today," she replied. "Your approach to our trials has been unlike anything we have ever seen." Jake felt his face getting warm. "I hope I have not offended anyone by doing things differently." "On the contrary," Princess Luna said with a smile. "You have reminded us that there are many different kinds of strength. May I ask you something?" The third day of the tournament brought a different kind of challenge, and Jake could feel the atmosphere in the arena had changed. Word of his unexpected successes had spread throughout the galaxy, and beings from hundreds of worlds were now watching, specifically to see what the human would do next. Some wanted him to succeed, but many more wanted to see him fail and prove that humans were just lucky primitives. The third trial was a test of cunning, and it took place in an ancient labyrinth, buried deep beneath the royal palace. The maze had been built thousands of years ago by the first Zephyrian emperors and was filled with traps, riddles, and illusions designed to challenge the mind rather than the body. Many warriors had died in this maze over the centuries, and their bones still decorated some of the deeper passages. Jake stood with the other remaining contestants at the entrance to the labyrinth. Several warriors had been eliminated in the first two trials, unable to keep up with the pace or suffering injuries that prevented them from continuing. Those who remained were the elite of their species, and they looked at Jake with mixtures of curiosity, respect, and hostility. The rules for this trial were simple. Each contestant would enter the maze alone and had to reach the center chamber where a golden amulet waited. The first to return with the amulet would win the trial. There was no time limit, but the maze was designed to become more dangerous the longer someone remained inside. Commander Stone cracked his massive knuckles and glared at the entrance. "Walls mean nothing to the Brutari," he announced. "I will smash through every barrier until I reach the prize war leader." Thex examined his weapons and nodded approvingly. "The Corvin do not fear ancient traps," he declared. "Our armor will protect us. From whatever this maze contains," Mind Bender Kalo's eyes glowed with psychic energy. "The Nethians will read the maze's secrets from the minds of those who built it," he said confidently. "No riddle can stand against our mental powers, Swift Runner. Zara simply stretched like a cat preparing to run. The Veltari will move too quickly for any trap to catch us," she stated with calm confidence. Jake said nothing. He was studying the entrance to the maze, looking for clues about what lay beyond. The stone walls were covered in ancient Zephyrian writing and symbols that told the story of the maze's construction. While the other warriors focused on their own abilities, Jake was trying to understand the minds of the builders. When the signal came to begin, each contestant chose their own approach. Commander Stone immediately began smashing through walls, creating his own path through brute force. The sound of breaking stone echoed through the tunnels as he carved a straight line toward where he thought the center might be. War leader Thex moved more carefully, but still relied primarily on strength. When he encountered traps, he simply triggered them and trusted his armor to protect him from the consequences. His forearms allowed him to manipulate multiple mechanisms at once, giving him advantages in rooms with complex puzzles. Mind Bender. Kalo tried to use his psychic abilities to read the thoughts of ancient builders, but found that the maze had been constructed with psychic shields specifically designed to prevent such intrusion. Frustrated, he began using his powers to move obstacles rather than understand them. Swift Runner. Zara lived up to her name by moving through the maze so quickly that many traps could not activate in time to catch her. Her strategy was to reach the center before the maze's defenses could adapt to her presence. Jake took a completely different approach. Instead of rushing forward, he spent time in each chamber studying the decorative elements that other contestants ignored. The builders had not just created a maze, they had told stories in stone and metal about Zephyrian history and culture. The first major obstacle was a room filled with rotating blades that moved in patterns too complex for most beings to predict. Commander Stone had simply smashed the mechanism that controlled them. War leader Thex had used his armor to deflect the blades while pushing through. Mind Bender Kalo had used telekinesis to stop the blades temporarily. Jake watched the patterns for several minutes and realized they were not random. The blades moved in sequences that matched the rhythm of ancient Zephyrian war chants. By moving to the beat of the music that the builders had encoded in the mechanism, Jake was able to dance through the spinning death trap without touching a single blade. The second obstacle was a chamber filled with riddles written in Old Zephyrian. Most contestants could not read the ancient language and either guessed at answers or tried to bypass the puzzle entirely. Jake had spent his years as a trader, learning fragments of many alien languages, including some archaic Zephyrian. More importantly, he approached the riddles not as individual puzzles, but as parts of a larger story. Each answer led to the next question, and the entire sequence told the tale of a legendary Zephyrian hero. By understanding the story, Jake was able to predict the answers even when he did not fully understand the language. The third major challenge was a hall of mirrors that created illusions designed to confuse and disorient intruders. Many warriors had become lost in this chamber, chasing reflections of themselves or seeing enemies that did not exist. The Brutari had smashed most of the mirrors. The Corvin had closed his eyes and relied on other senses. Jake realized that the Mirrors were not just creating random illusions. They were showing each person their own fears and desires reflected back in distorted ways. By acknowledging what the mirrors were showing him, rather than fighting the illusions, Jake was able to see through them to find the real exit. As he moved deeper into the maze, Jake began to understand the true purpose of the labyrinth. It was not just a test of cunning, but a teaching tool designed to help Zephyrian royalty understand the nature of leadership. Each challenge represented a different aspect of ruling wisdom: strength, compassion, and sacrifice. When Jake finally reached the center chamber, he found something unexpected. The golden amulet was there as promised, but so was mind-bender Kalo. The Nethian had arrived first, using his psychic powers to overcome many obstacles, but he was standing frozen in place, staring at the amulet with fear in his glowing eyes. The final trap, Jake realized. The amulet itself was protected by some kind of mental barrier that prevented anyone from taking it unless they met certain criteria. Mind-bender. Kalo's psychic sensitivity made him more vulnerable to whatever defense the ancient builders had created. Jake approached carefully and extended his senses the way Kate had taught him to do when diagnosing problems with their ship's systems. The amulet radiated something that felt almost alive but not hostile. It was testing him, measuring his intentions and motivations. The defense system had been designed to ensure that only someone worthy of leadership could claim the prize. It was not looking for strength or cunning, but for something deeper: the willingness to serve others rather than seeking power for its own sake. Jake reached out and touched the amulet, feeling a brief moment of contact with the minds of ancient Zephyrian emperors. They had built this test to find leaders who would put their people's needs before their own desires. The amulet accepted Jake because his motivations were pure, even if he had not originally intended to compete in the tournament. Mind-bender Kalo watched in amazement as Jake lifted the golden amulet without any apparent effort. "How did you overcome the mental barrier, human?" "My psychic powers should make me more capable, not less." Jake helped the Nethian to his feet, and together they began the journey back to the entrance. "I think that was exactly the problem," he explained. The test was not about having psychic powers, but about having the right reasons for wanting to lead. When they emerged from the maze, Jake was declared the winner of the third trial. The crowd's reaction was mixed, with some species cheering for the underdog human, while others grumbled about luck and tricks. But Princess Luna was watching from her royal box with an expression that Jake was beginning to recognize. That evening, she visited him again at his quarters. This time she seemed less formal, more like someone seeking answers to difficult questions. "You have surprised us all. Jake Morrison," she said as they walked through the palace gardens. 3 trials and 3 victories. Though not in the ways anyone expected, Jake felt uncomfortable with her praise. "I have been lucky, Your Highness. The other warriors are much more skilled than I am." Princess Luna stopped walking and turned to face him. "Luck had nothing to do with what you accomplished in that maze," she said seriously. "You succeeded because you understood something that the others missed." "What was that?" Jake asked. "That the maze was not built to test warriors," she replied. "It was built to test leaders. And there is a difference between the two, even if my people sometimes forget that." They continued walking in comfortable silence until they reached a balcony that overlooked the city below. Thousands of lights twinkled in the darkness, representing millions of beings from dozens of species who had come to witness the tournament. "Can I ask you something personal, Your Highness?" Jake said finally. Luna smiled. "After everything we have shared, I think you can call me Luna." Jake felt his heart skip a beat at the informality. Luna, then. "Why did you ask for this tournament to be open to all species? It would have been easier to limit it to traditional warrior races." Luna was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because I believe that strength comes in many forms," she said finally. "My people have always valued physical prowess." The 4th trial arrived with heavy gray clouds hanging over Astro's prime, and Jake could sense that something had changed in the tournament's atmosphere. Only 4 contestants remained after the maze trial, and the competition had become intensely personal. Commander Stone glared at Jake with undisguised hatred, while war leader Thex treated him with grudging respect. Swift Runner Zara had begun studying Jake's techniques, trying to understand his unconventional approaches. More importantly, the royal court had divided into factions. Some nobles supported traditional candidates like Commander Stone, believing that only proven warriors should marry into the imperial family. Others were intrigued by Jake's innovative methods and wondered if new thinking might benefit the Empire. The tension was thick enough to cut with a blade. The fourth trial was announced as a test of courage, but Jake soon learned it was unlike any challenge he could have imagined. Instead of facing external dangers, each contestant would be subjected to Zephyrian dream-weaving technology that would force them to confront their deepest fears made manifest. The dream chambers were ancient devices built into the foundation of the royal palace. They could reach into a being's subconscious mind and create realistic illusions based on their greatest terrors. Many warriors had entered these chambers over the centuries, and some had never emerged with their sanity intact. Each contestant would face their trial alone, with only the Dreamweavers monitoring their vital signs to prevent permanent damage. The goal was not to defeat the fears, but to demonstrate courage in the face of them. How each warrior responded would determine their ranking in the trial. Commander Stone entered his chamber first, and the royal court watched through viewing crystals as his trial began. The massive Brutari found himself shrinking, becoming smaller and weaker until he was no larger than a child. His greatest fear was helplessness, the inability to protect others through strength. The crowd watched as he struggled against enemies he could not fight and barriers he could not break. War leader Thex faced a different nightmare. His 4 arms were bound and his weapons taken away while ghostly figures of his ancestors surrounded him, declaring that he had brought dishonor to his family name. The proud Corvan warrior fought desperately to prove his worth, but the ghosts only grew more numerous with each failure. Swift runner Zara's trial was perhaps the cruelest. She found herself trapped in an endless series of cages and chains, each one smaller than the last. Her species valued freedom of movement above almost everything else, and the Dreamweavers had created a prison specifically designed to break her spirit through confinement. When Jake's turn came, he approached the dream chamber with his heart pounding. He had no idea what his deepest fears might manifest as, but he suspected it would be something related to failure and letting others down. The chamber was a simple room with smooth walls and a single chair in the center. Jake sat down and waited for the dream weaving to begin. At first, nothing happened, and he wondered if the ancient technology was malfunctioning. Then reality began to shift around him, and he found himself standing on the bridge of his cargo ship watching helplessly as catastrophe unfolded. The nightmare showed him Kate dying from system failures he could have prevented if only he had been a better engineer. It showed him Earth under attack while he stood powerless to help his home world. Worst of all, it showed him Princess Luna and the Zephyrian people suffering because he had failed as their leader, failing not through lack of courage, but through inadequate knowledge and experience. The fear was overwhelming, and Jake felt himself beginning to panic. But then he remembered something Kate had taught him during their years traveling together. When ship systems failed completely, the best response was not to fight the failure, but to accept it and work around it. Jake sat down, in the middle of his nightmare, and began to meditate using breathing techniques he had learned during long, lonely voyages between stars. Instead of trying to battle his fears, he acknowledged them as valid concerns while refusing to let them paralyze him with terror. Yes, he might fail. Yes, people he cared about might suffer because of his inadequacies. But those possibilities could not be allowed to prevent him from trying to do better. Fear was useful information about potential dangers, but it should inform decisions rather than control them. The Dreamweavers monitoring Jake's trial were confused by his response. Most beings either fought their fears directly or were overwhelmed by them. Jake was doing something they had never seen before, simply accepting the existence of his fears while choosing to act despite them. The illusions began to fade as the technology could not maintain scenarios that the subject refused to engage with emotionally. Jake opened his eyes to find himself back in the simple chamber with the Dreamweavers staring at him in bewilderment. "How did you overcome the fear constructs?" one of them asked. "They were calibrated to your specific psychological patterns. I did not overcome them," Jake replied. "I just decided they did not have to control me." When the results were announced, Jake was declared the winner of the courage trial, though the judges had difficulty explaining exactly how he had succeeded. His approach had been so different from traditional concepts of bravery that they struggled to categorize it. The 5th trial was scheduled for the following day, and it would test the quality that Zephyrians valued above all others' honor: Jake spent that evening walking through the palace gardens, trying to prepare himself mentally for whatever challenge awaited. He was surprised to find Emperor Voss himself, sitting alone on a stone bench, feeding small winged creatures that reminded Jake of Earth butterflies. The Emperor looked up as Jake approached and gestured for him to sit down. "Your Majesty," Jake said while bowing respectfully. The Emperor waved dismissively. "We are alone, human. There is no need for excessive formality." Jake sat carefully, keeping some distance between himself and the most powerful being in the known galaxy. Emperor Voss was smaller than his daughter, but there was an intensity about him that made Jake understand why entire